This is almost the last stop on a tour that began about 2 months ago that has taken me to a number of cities, beginning with Boston. I spoke at the University of Boston. And after that, a couple of cities in Canada and California on the sanctions against Venezuela. And the talk on sanctions on Venezuela goes beyond just the issue of the sanctions themselves. Because I think that in order to understand the implications of the sanctions against Venezuela, you have to know something about Venezuela. You have to know something about the Venezuelan government, the current government of Nicolas Maduro, the previous government of Hugo Chavez, and you have to go back somewhat. You have to understand what's happening today in the historical context. But if I have to reduce everything that I've said in these different presentations in just a few words, it's quite simple. And that is, what's happening in Venezuela is not simple. It's complex. And that statement, in a sense, goes against the narrative coming out of Washington that demonizes Maduro, but not only demonizes Maduro, but demonizes much more. What President Trump is saying and what others in the Trump administration are saying is not just that Maduro, everything that he does is evil, but that the system itself, the model itself, is evil. And what's happening in Venezuela demonstrates that, well, that model, which is socialism, doesn't work. There's one fallacy, among others. There are a lot of fallacies in this statement, but the basic fallacy is that Venezuela is not socialist. So if you draw the conclusion that the problems that Venezuela is facing, the many very deep economic problems that Venezuela is facing, is due to the model, and you claim that that shows that socialism doesn't work, you ignore the fact that 80% of the Venezuelan economy is private. Perhaps what's happening in Venezuela is due to the fact, if you're going to blame something, maybe blame capitalism, because the Venezuelan economy is capitalist, it's not socialist. But in addition to discussing the complexity of Venezuela, in addition to refuting the narrative that's coming out of Washington and the narrative of the Trump administration, I would also like to question the arguments of some people who would consider themselves on the left side of the political spectrum, who take a position what I refer to as a plague on both your houses, which is that Maduro is just as bad as the opposition, that Maduro has to go, and that being on the left side of the political spectrum, these political activists in some cases, scholars in other cases, would be opposed to the sanctions. They'd be opposed to the threat of the military option, which Trump has brought up on more than one occasion. Thank you. But they disconnect that situation with the sanctions, with the war on Venezuela, with the errors that have been committed. In other words, they're two separate topics. Your sanctions and Maduro and everything that he's done wrong, as if those two topics are unrelated. So in my presentation, I'd like to discuss these two narratives about Venezuela. I'd like to question the validity and, in a sense, refute those narratives. The first place to begin in order to refute that line of thinking, is to ask the question, if Chavez and Maduro have been so evil, have been so wrong in everything that they've done, how can we explain the fact that the Chavistas have won so many elections since Chavez was first elected in 1998? There have been over 20 elections, and the Chavistas have won all but two. They lost one election by a slim margin in 2007, and they lost another election by a substantial margin in December of 2015 for the National Assembly. But with those two exceptions, the other elections that have taken place since 1998, the Chavistas have won. In fact, Chavez won the presidential elections of 2006 with the highest percentage of votes of any presidential candidate in Venezuela in modern democratic history, going back to 1958. And even in the case of Maduro, even if you consider the fact that in the last presidential elections there was a high abstention rate, which was a little over 50%, the fact that Maduro received such a high percentage, the candidate, his main rival, received approximately 20%, I forget the exact figure, maybe 22%. How do we explain that? Even in such a difficult situation, with an economic crisis, if you want to call it that, that Maduro gets such a high percentage, even considering the fact that more than 50% of the people didn't vote, a little bit more than 50% didn't vote. When we consider that other Latin American leaders, their popularity has dipped way below that of Maduro. For instance, Santos in Colombia, his popularity was below 20%. Peña Nieto, the year before last year, in 2017, his popularity was about 16%, and it increased a little bit in 2018. Temer in Brazil, whose popularity fluctuated between 3 and 4 percentage points. So I think this is a question we have to ask. How do we explain the fact that the Chavistas have won so many elections? If the model doesn't work, if, at least in the case of Maduro, he's incompetent, everything he does and says is wrong, how do we explain these electoral successes over such an extended period of time? Well, some people in the opposition talk about the fact that Venezuela is not democratic, and specifically electoral fraud. But the term electoral fraud really isn't used a lot. When you examine the discourse of the opposition, even the radical, what I call the radical opposition, the fringe, or the radical opposition, those who are most opposed to the government and are unwilling to negotiate, they reject dialogue. Recently, they haven't participated in the elections. They talk about the fact that you don't have a level playing field. That's the gist of their argument. But they usually don't use the term electoral fraud, and when they do, they're referring to something that in my definition of fraud is not fraud. I would define fraud, and it's a semantical issue, but I would define fraud as votes not getting counted correctly. That is the line that I draw between democracy and a country that's not democratic. If you have a situation in which you have the tampering of electoral results on a massive scale, that country cannot be considered democratic. But the fact of the matter is that James Carter, who observed the elections personally in Venezuela in 2004, and his Carter Center has observed elections in Venezuela, and Carter stated that of all the electoral processes that the Carter Center has observed, over 90 elections throughout the world, the Venezuelan electoral system is the best. And he said that because the system, the electoral system, really virtually rules out the possibility of fraud, at least fraud on anything, any massive scale, because it's a dual system. It's based, I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm not Venezuelan. I've lived in Venezuela, since I was a graduate student from the University of New Mexico in 1975, and I've been a resident since the late 70s, which allows me to vote in municipal and statewide elections. I can't vote at the national level. So I voted on a number of occasions, and I'll tell you how it works. The vote is electronic, but then there is a ballot that comes out of the machine, and you examine the candidates that you voted for. If there's any discrepancy, well, you're going to say something, but that never happens. So you verify that that vote is accurate, and you sign the paper, and you put the ballot in the ballot box. And there is an auditing process of nearly 50% of the voting centers. So that, if there were any discrepancy between the paper ballot and the digital results, the digital tally, then somebody would say something, but that never happens. So it seems to me, now when members of the opposition sometimes talk about electoral fraud, they'll say, people voted more than once. It sounds like Trump talking about the electoral results in 2006, and he really won those elections by considering the popular vote, because there were over 3 million people, 3 million immigrants who voted illegally. It sounds like something like that, because, if people are voting more than once, that would be very easy to document. The opposition has plenty of resources. They're supported by the business sector, Fedicomitas, the Chamber of Commerce. They're supported certainly from Washington, and they would just have to take a couple of photographs, and that would be, a major news item throughout the world. So that isn't happening. If it's happening, it's happening in a couple of cases, but it's not happening on anything remotely close to a massive scale. So the question, how do you explain the electoral successes of the Chavistas? If you don't have electoral fraud, if those votes are getting counted correctly, then obviously there is some, explanation. If it was a question of one election or even 2 electoral cycles, but we're talking about a 20-year period. And I think that in order to understand that political success, we have to go back to the 1990s to understand how is it that Chavez got elected in the first place. In the 1990s, that was the heyday of neoliberalism in Venezuela and the rest of Latin America. And in Venezuela, the Venezuelan economy during the 1990s practically ceased to be Venezuelan. That is, you had massive privatization as you had throughout Latin America. But unlike some Latin American countries such as Argentina and Chile and Brazil and Mexico, where native capitalists bought some of the companies that were privatized, in the case of Venezuela, like in the case of Peru, practically all the companies that were privatized were bought by multinational corporations. So steel, which was the pride of Venezuela, it was a state-run company. Sidor is the name of the company. That was privatized and bought by an international consortium. The telecommunications, which was state-run, was privatized and eventually bought by Verizon. The electricity company, which was owned by the family of Maria Corina Machado. I mentioned before the radical opposition. Well, she is the most radical of the radicals. Her family, the family of Machado Zuluaga, sold the electricity company to a US-based company. So you had one company after another in the strategic sectors of the economy that were getting sold to foreign capital. The Bank of Venezuela, the oldest bank in Venezuela, was bought by Banco Santander. Banco Provincial, which might have been the biggest bank in the 1990s, was bought by another Spanish bank, Bilbao Vizcaya. Chocolate, Savoy, another example of the pride of Venezuela, the Venezuelan chocolate industry, some say the best chocolate in the world. That was bought by Nestle. The cement industry, which was also privately owned by the Rockefeller of Venezuela, Eugenio Mendoza. He died, I guess, in the late 1880s, and his company was bought out by a Japanese company, then Cemex of Mexico. So Chavez comes along with a nationalist discourse. And part of the nationalist discourse was a discourse of economic nationalism. Our economy has ceased to be Venezuelan. And in the 1990s, even though that trend of the denationalization of the Venezuelan economy was the most important development in Venezuela in the decade of the 1990s, the politicians of the ruling parties, the two main parties in Venezuela, AD and COPEI, and the Caldera, Rafael Caldera government. Caldera was a founding member of COPEI who left COPEI and was elected president in '93. None of those political actors were talking about the most important development in Venezuela in the 1990s. Nobody was talking about the fact that the Venezuelan economy was being bought out by foreign capital. I think that's, so Chavez is elected in '98, and he renationalized these companies. The Banco de Venezuela was taken over from Banco Santander. The electricity company was nationalized. Telecommunications, Canteve is the name of the company, that was nationalized. The cement industry was nationalized. So this idea that the strategic sectors of the economy should be state-run, that was a banner that goes way back to the 1930s and 1940s in Venezuela. And it was a banner which, in which there was a near consensus in Venezuela. Even conservative parties such as COPEI supported that idea. Not everybody did, but most political actors did. And that was incorporated in the Constitution of 1961. That is, that the state should control the strategic sectors of the economy. Chavez made that a reality. And so I think that's part of the explanation why there was this feeling among the population in general that Chavez was doing something right for Venezuela. There's another issue that I wanted to raise, particularly because it's a labor issue, which people in the United States are not too sensitive or aware of, but that is the system of severance payment. In Latin America, and specifically Venezuela, the system of severance payment is of extreme importance. Historically, it goes back to 1936. Caldera, whose name I just mentioned, was a founder of that system in 1936. And the idea is that a worker gets paid, when a worker leaves a company, regardless of the motivation, whether he or she is laid off for justified reasons, unjustified reasons, if the worker dies, his or her family members have a right to severance payment. So that is a sacred right, and it was based on the workers, the calculation of that severance payment was based on the worker's last salary. So that system was eliminated in 1997. In the context of neoliberalism, Teodoro Petkov, who was a leftist going back to the 60s, he was a communist guerrilla in the 60s, but in the course of his political, he just passed away a couple weeks ago. In the course of his political career, he went from the left to from the far left, even left of the leadership of the Communist Party, as a matter of fact, in a centrist direction. And he was minister of the planning minister, and he was the one that designed this new labor reform in 1997 that eliminated the system of severance payment based on the worker's last salary. There was a divide in the labor movement between the labor leadership and the rank and file. I mean, this was quite obvious that in 1997, all the workers were opposed to that reform, of the elimination of that system. And the leadership of the main confederation of workers, the CTV, the Confederación de Trabajadores de Venezuela, that leadership, specifically the leaders of the two main parties, AD and COPEI, they at first rejected any modification of that system and stated that they were unwilling to even negotiate. And by 1997, they put their name to the reform of the labor system, the system of severance payment. So Chavez was at that point running for office as candidate for president, and he, I think, participated in a protest against the reform. And in the case, he opposed the elimination of that system. And in 2011, Chavez created a commission to draft a new labor law. That commission was headed by the foreign minister at the time, Nicolas Maduro, and they drafted a new labor law which reestablished the old system of severance payment. So that is another factor that I think explains, Chavez's popularity, and to a certain extent Maduro's, the support that Maduro has. The fact that Maduro comes from the labor movement, he was a labor leader, and he was the president of that commission that drafted that new labor legislation. So, fast track to the situation in Venezuela following Chavez's death in 2013. 2014, the price of oil nosedived, beginning in August of 2014. And that's really when more or less when the crisis, the economic crisis situation began in Venezuela. There are three explanations, or three factors, in my opinion, that explain the difficult economic situation in Venezuela today. One is the price of oil. Venezuela has been dependent on oil since the 1920s. In the late 20s, it became the world's leading exporter of oil until 1970. And everybody in Venezuela knows that when the price of oil declines, that creates great economic difficulties in the country, and it has political ramifications. Nevertheless, the opposition states that the problems of Venezuela are not due to the decline of the price of oil, it's due to the incompetence of the Maduro government. I don't think that they believe what they're saying, because everybody in Venezuela knows that Venezuela is highly dependent on oil, and as a matter of fact, we know that oil exporting countries, or at least third world countries that depend on oil exports, are more dependent on oil than other third world countries are dependent on their primary commodity exports. Oil is a special case. In the case of Saudi Arabia, in the case of Nigeria, or Indonesia, all of those oil exporting countries in the third world are more dependent on oil than is the case with other third world countries. But in any case, that's one factor. The second factor, in my opinion, is the errors that the government has committed. And I think that I would point to two errors, which I think is partly responsible for the economic difficulties and the political difficulties as well that Venezuela faces. One is that Maduro has not attached importance to the market. I think he's got somewhat of a dogmatic, perhaps Marxist mindset, in which the market is considered something specific to capitalism. Now that's an issue that has been debated among even Marxist scholars. Some claim that the market is not specific to capitalism, that there's nothing incompatible between socialism and the market. Without getting into that issue, the fact of the matter is, as I said before, Venezuela is not socialist, it's capitalist. And you cannot run an economy in which you have a price structure which is divorced from the market value of different products. That's not to say that the regulation of prices is not recommendable. You can have administered prices, as you've had in Venezuela going way back in time, at least back to the 1970s. But when you have a disparity between the price of certain basic commodities and the market price, and in this case the black market price, if that disparity is more than 2 to 1, then you're going to have problems. When you have a disparity when the administered price of a given product is below the cost of production, that is a recipe for problems. Among other things, it means that state companies that are producing some of these basic commodities are producing at a loss. And so that was okay when the price of oil was up above $100 a barrel for Venezuelan oil, and the government could subsidize the state companies that had been nationalized. But when the price of oil nosedived, that meant that the government could not subsidize state companies, and state companies ran into difficulties. So the most obvious example of this is the price of gasoline, which up until recently was practically free in Venezuela. So you had a situation in which the oil industry was losing, millions of dollars, and because Venezuela belongs to OPEC, and OPEC regulates oil production, that meant a substantial, number of barrels of oil that could not be exported. And so the Venezuelan government was losing a lot of money as a result. Had they sold that gasoline at market prices, or had they sold it at a price that had some relationship to the market price of oil, you would have less consumption of oil. And so that would have saved the country a lot of money. So I believe that is one explanation, one factor that explains the economic difficulties of Venezuela, this tremendous disparity. And you see it with regard to exchange controls. Venezuela has had a system of exchange controls off and on since 1983. Chavez reestablished the system that was discontinued in the 1990s in the context of neoliberal governments, but he reestablished it in 2003. While Chavez was president, there was a disparity of 2 to 1. In other words, the official price of the dollar was at one point 4.3 bolivares to the dollar. The black market rate was fluctuating between 8 and 9 bolivares. So you had a 2 to 1 ratio. When Chavez went off to Cuba, and shortly after that died, that disparity got out of hand, and the price of the dollar skyrocketed. And so that 2 to 1 ratio went up to 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 10 to 1. It got out of hand. And although it would have been difficult to have corrected, Maduro, I believe, should have acted. It would not have been easy, but he should have made an attempt. He should have done more than what he did. And I think that part of the explanation for that is precisely because of a lack of appreciation of the basic importance of the marketplace in the economy, at least in the Venezuelan economy. And the second criticism that I would have of Maduro is that, in a difficult situation such as what Maduro is facing now, and with such enemies, the internal opposition, the Catholic hierarchy, the private media, not to mention the United States government, that only in situations in which the governing party has the upper hand can you really make bold moves, bold but necessary moves. And Maduro has had instances like that in which he could have achieved certain objectives. He could have acted. For instance, when the Chavistas won municipal elections in December of 2013 by an 11.5% difference, 11.5% margin. When the violent protests in 2014 were defeated, they went on for 4 months. And when they were discontinued in mid-2014, that was another moment in which the government had the upper hand and Maduro could have acted. There was a lot he could have done, and he didn't. So that is a second criticism that I have of Maduro. So I mentioned before that the economic situation in Venezuela, in my mind, can be explained on the basis of 3 different factors. The first one was the price of oil. The second one was the errors of the Maduro government. And the third one, which I give equal weight to, if not more, is the hostility against the Chavez and Maduro governments. The opposition in Venezuela is what political scientists call a disloyal opposition. That is, an opposition that does not recognize the legitimacy of the government, that does everything possible to bring about regime change. And that has been the case with the Venezuelan opposition almost from the very beginning, at least from 2001. The Venezuelan opposition has not recognized the legitimacy of Chavez and Maduro, claiming that, firstly, that Venezuela is on the road to dictatorship, and secondly, that, attacking, criticizing everything that the government does. In other words, the government doesn't get anything right. That would, in effect, question the legitimacy of the government. And thirdly, actions of a legal, semi-legal, and illegal nature in order to bring about regime change. That political opposition, from the very outset, was supported by the business sector, the Chamber of Commerce, Fedicámaras, which throughout its entire history, since its founding in 1944, stated that it could not get involved in political activity because it was a business organization and business people don't do that. In 1948, it refused to come out against an impending military coup. The ex-president of Venezuela, Romo Betancourt, called on the Chamber of Commerce to make a pronouncement in order to avert a military coup, and that's what Fedicámaras stated in 1948. We can't do that. Even if we wanted to, we can't do that because that is not our area of responsibility and expertise and interest. We don't do this. And that was their position all along up until Chavez. The coup against Chavez in April 2002 was really all about Fedicámaras. It was a coup in which the traditional political leaders participated, but the president of Venezuela, for those 2 days that Chavez was removed from office, was no one less than the president of Fedicámaras. And 7 or 8 months later, there was a 2-month general strike. The objective was to bring about regime change, and although the politicians, the head of the traditional labor organization, who was a member of AD, Carlos Ortega, and others led that strike, the real leader was the president of Fedicámaras. After the president of Fedicámaras at the time of the coup was out of the country, his successor, Carlos Fernandez, he was the real leader behind that 2-month general strike. So that this was the opposition that the Venezuelan government faced and is facing. The church hierarchy, the private media, at the time of the coup in April of 2002, the day after the coup, everybody saw this on TV. Napoleon Bravo and another very well-known TV personality stated, congratulations, we will congratulate ourselves. The media, thanks to the media, we got rid of Chavez. If it wasn't because of the media, what happened yesterday would not have taken place. That's what they stated, and everybody knows that to be a fact. So the third factor that explains the current situation, in my opinion, is the aggressiveness of the internal opposition and the foreign actors, specifically Washington. And now, the sanctions that are currently in place have a lot to do with that. And I'm sure a lot of you know something about those sanctions. There's certainly been articles about them in the media. But I think that it's important to emphasize that the effect of the sanctions go beyond the direct effects of those sanctions. That is, the sanctions state that the Venezuelan oil company Citgo, which is 100% Venezuelan owned, Venezuela bought it in the 1980s, cannot repatriate profits. Previously, Citgo sent to Venezuela approximately $1 billion a year. So Venezuela is being deprived of $1 billion a year because the sanctions stipulate that Citgo can't do that. The sanctions also state that the U.S. financial institutions cannot purchase bonds from the Venezuelan government. That has made it very difficult for Venezuela to refinance the public debt. Any country in a difficult economic situation is going to attempt to do that. But given the fact that the U.S. financial institutions are not allowed to purchase bonds from the Venezuelan state, from PDVSA, the state oil company, from the Venezuelan government, that makes refinancing the debt extremely difficult. More recently, the Maduro government has stipulated that the United States, nobody in the United States, U.S. citizens or people living in the United States, can have anything to do with the gold industry. Those Venezuelans who are accused of being corrupt, the sanction states that any corrupt gold, in other words, gold coming from Venezuela, coming from the corrupt Maduro government, that U.S. Citizens and people living in the United States cannot purchase. The Maduro government has implemented a very ambitious program. It's called the Arco Minero del Orinoco, to exploit the gold in an attempt to diversify production, diversify the Venezuelan economy. That region south of the Orinoco River is very rich in gold, in diamonds, in coltan, in copper. And so this is a very important project that the Maduro government has implemented. So these sanctions are affecting Venezuela directly in a very big way. But in addition to that, there are other effects of these sanctions, which I think are important to point out. And that is that the targeted sanctions, which go back to Trump, who devised a list of Venezuelans who are accused of being corrupt, accused of being involved in money laundering or drug trafficking. They are, this list, any accounts, bank accounts that they have in the United States will be frozen. They're not allowed to travel. They won't be given visas to travel to the United States. And that list was part of an executive order in 2015 in which Obama declared Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security. At the time, people considered that to be somewhat of a joke. Firstly, of course, Venezuela is not a threat to U.S. national security. And secondly, anybody who thinks a little bit about it will kind of laugh at that list of people who are being sanctioned, the targeted sanctions, because nobody would be that dumb to have a bank account in the United States. I mean, if you do have Chavistas who are corrupt, and there is a problem, a serious problem of corruption in Venezuela, but nobody would have their money stashed away in the United States knowing full well that this is a policy of the U.S. government. As a matter of fact, it's a policy of the U.S. government. That list of targeted sanctions is unnecessary because U.S. law states the same for any corrupt money in the United States. But the list of targeted sanctions have a very big effect on the Venezuelan economy. And I think that's what is not getting reported, that's not getting talked about in the media or even in Venezuela, even the Venezuelan government, that when they talk about the economic war against Venezuela and they talk about the effects of the sanctions, they talk about the direct effect of the sanctions, but they don't talk much about the indirect effects. That is, that once Venezuela was declared a threat to U.S. national security, and that executive order was reissued the following year and has been reissued by Trump, that is going to convince any CEO of a U.S. company not to invest in Venezuela. And after that decree or executive order in 2015, Ford Motor Company pulled out of Venezuela. Kimberly-Clark, that produces items of personal wear such as paper towels and diapers, they pulled out of Venezuela. Under Trump, when he reissued the decree and the sanctions, General Motors pulled out of Venezuela. More recently, Kellogg's pulled out of Venezuela. So that this has had a major effect on the Venezuelan economy that really hasn't been reported. But now with the sanctions on Iran, we know exactly what was happening to the Venezuelan economy. Because in the case of Iran, there is a lot of information in the media. For instance, Time magazine reported that 100 companies, 100 multinationals have pulled out of Iran as a result of the sanctions against Iran just a couple of weeks ago. Shell and Total, two European companies based in Great Britain and France respectively, they announced that they would not purchase oil from Iran, even though their respective governments oppose the sanctions. But they're afraid of retaliation from the United States. SWIFT, another European very important financial institution, announced, and you can Google this, because their words, almost word for word, was we don't want to destabilize, or we don't want to run the risk of destabilizing the world financial system. And so they announced that they will not have anything to do with financial institutions in Iran. So, we see clearly in the case of Iran that even though these sanctions are sanctions, imposed by a U.S. government, applied to the United States, that there is a fear of retaliation. And companies throughout the world, non-U.S. multinational corporations, are also complying with the sanctions. And if that's happening in the case of Iran, it certainly was the case with Venezuela, going back to at least 2015 with the executive order of the Obama administration. How am I doing time-wise?
I think you're at an hour.
What's that?
It's 2 o'clock now.
Oh, it's an hour. So we want to open this up to questions, comments, and so I'll sum up as best as I can. As a university professor, that's not an easy task. I mentioned at the outset that my discussion of the context to understand the sanctions is designed to refute the simplicity of the Trump administration and others by demonstrating that what's happening in Venezuela is much more complex, that there are various factors at play, one of which is the price of oil, which is really beyond the reach of Venezuelan policy, that errors have something to do with it, but also what the Maduro people call the economic war. That's a term that the Chavistas use a lot, but I prefer just to use the word war because it takes in a lot more than economics. It has political ramifications. For instance, when Trump talks about the military option and says that a military coup would undoubtedly succeed in Venezuela. I mean, in effect, he's saying that the U.S. government would support a military coup against Maduro. And he said that at the side of Ivan Duque, the recently elected president of Colombia. That tends to politically polarize Latin America and polarize politics in Venezuela. It polarizes Latin America because the Latin American countries have been very hostile. Most of the Latin American governments have been very hostile to the Maduro government. But when the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, seconded what Trump said about the military option and stated that the military option should not be discarded, the Latin American members of the Lima Group, which is a group of countries in the hemisphere taking in the United States and Canada, which have met in order to decide on a common policy towards Venezuela. The Latin American countries stated explicitly, publicly, that they were opposed to that military option. But now with the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil and with the election of Duque in Colombia, I mean, these are two hardliners. Duque is a member of Uribe's party, which is connected with the paramilitary people in Colombia. And so with that background, it's quite plausible that Trump pushing the military option with Bolsonaro, who during the campaign implied that Brazil would consider military intervention in Venezuela, and with Duque in Colombia, I mean, that could change things in terms of Latin America. And internally in Venezuela, the same thing. Venezuelan politics has been very polarized ever since Chavez was first elected, but it's become increasingly polarized. But a lot of people don't know that within Venezuela, within the Venezuelan opposition, there's polarization. There's a radical, and I'm not going to use the word fringe because they're really the dominant sector of the opposition that at this point opposes dialogue. Maduro has stated that he is in favor of dialogue with the opposition. The radicals are opposed to sitting down with Maduro, sitting down with the Maduro government and looking for areas in common in order to find a way out of the political and economic situation in Venezuela. And they're opposed to electoral participation. But not all of the opposition is that way. In fact, elections are coming up shortly in Venezuela at the municipal level. And one of the two main traditional parties in Venezuela, COPEI, I mentioned COPEI several times, COPEI is participating in those elections. The party MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo, which is a party of Teodoro Petkov, I mentioned his name previously, MAS is also participating in those elections. The hard line coming from the Trump administration pulls the rug out from under the moderates in the opposition. I say moderates, I'm not referring to moderates with regard to economic policy. They're all neoliberals, basically. But moderates in terms of political strategy. And so the moderates who support electoral participation, who support dialogue, they're in a weaker position as a result of the narrative that's coming out of Washington, and as a result of the sanctions and the other measures that are coming out of Washington. So that has a polarizing effect. I mentioned at the outset that my talk is really designed to demonstrate the complexity of what's happening in Venezuela. That goes against this narrative coming out of Washington, but it also contradicts or questions the validity of those on the left side of the political spectrum who basically favor regime change. That is, they don't use the term regime change, but they say that Maduro has to go. And they say that Maduro is as bad as the opposition, and they basically place the two in the same sack. And, you know, there are a number of important scholars who have presented this position, and their basic argument is that their basic argument refers not only to Venezuela, it refers to the pink tide in general. And their basic argument is that none of these pink tide leaders have succeeded in diversifying the economy, that the economy is as dependent on the export of primary commodities, that is, commodities that are not getting refined, commodities that get refined and processed in the developed countries or other countries throughout the world. And so that's a basic vulnerability, that's a basic weak point in the economy going way back in time. And these progressive governments haven't done anything to sever that kind of dependency. And that argument is true. There are a number of scholars, Maristela Svampa, Eduardo Godinez from Argentina and Uruguay respectively. Svampa is a professor in Great Britain, and a number of others. Alberto Acosta, who was the right-hand man of Rafael Correa, who has become a firm critic of Correa. That's his position also. And there are a number of others. There's a Venezuelan scholar by the name of Edgardo Lander. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. And what they say about the dependence on basic commodities is true. Unfortunately, it's true. But my criticism of their position is that, firstly, they don't discuss the context. And the context is this war on Venezuela. The context is the disloyal opposition. The context is the the attempts to overthrow the government, the fact that the entire media, the private media, when Chavez came to power at the time of the coup, at the time of the general strike, you couldn't listen to any channel on TV, any station on the radio that was even-handed in its treatment of Chavez at the time of the attempted regime changes in 2002, 2003. They were all presenting the line of the opposition. So that mistakes are being made, but you have to understand those mistakes in the context. And these leftist scholars and leftist activists who basically say that Maduro is as bad as the opposition, they don't consider that. They don't consider the fact that Maduro is in a disadvantageous position if you compare Maduro with Chavez. Of course, Maduro doesn't have the charisma that Chavez had, and he doesn't have the political acumen that Chavez had, granted. But there are other factors that have to be brought into the picture. The change in the correlation of forces in the region and the world. When Chavez was president, the pink tide countries were allies and played an important role that supported the Chavez government in moments of difficulty. For instance, at the time of the general strike, Lula, who had just been elected president in Brazil, sent Venezuela gasoline. Oil production in Venezuela declined to practically zero. There were long lines outside of gasoline stations. And Lula sent gasoline to Venezuela. So that you compare that situation under Chavez with the situation under Maduro, in which you have all these conservative and right-wing governments in Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, etc. That factor has to be brought into the picture as well. And the second criticism that I have is that these scholars on the left side of the political spectrum don't talk about the pluses. They talk about the minuses, and much of what they say, in my opinion, is accurate. But, somebody who is on the left has to appreciate the importance of a nationalistic foreign policy. And that is a plus if you're coming from a leftist perspective. If you're on the right side of the political spectrum, well, that's a different story. But many of these scholars, like Acosta and Edgardo Lander, whose name I just mentioned, these people would consider themselves leftists. So the foreign policy of Chavez and Maduro and the other pink-tide countries represent a plus. These governments supported Latin American unity. They opposed Pan-Americanism, which means unity taking in the United States and Canada, which Chavez opposed in 2001 at the Quebec Summit of the Americas. He stated, Latin America has to unite. We're not anti-US. At some point, we can sit down and negotiate with the United States. The FTAA was a proposal going back to that period of the 1990s, and Chavez said, okay, maybe someday that can be considered. But first, Latin America has to unite, has to bring about Latin American integration, and then negotiate with the United States and Canada from a position of equality. So that is something that these scholars don't consider. The foreign policy of Chavez and Maduro, which is a nationalistic foreign policy. And I'll just end by mentioning one other plus for the Chavez and Maduro government, or for the Chavez government that Maduro has continued. And that is with regard to the social programs. The scholars who I've referred to who are critical of Maduro and take a plague on both your houses approach recognize, and one example of one of those scholars, by the way, is somebody that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, James Petrus, whose position is basically that. And Petrus naturally talks about the social programs in a favorable light, as well as many others. But what they basically say is the social programs were good because the social programs meant a distribution of goods and services to the poor. But what they don't say is something which is more important, or at least equally important, and that is that these social programs, talking specifically about the case of Venezuela, has generated a sense of participation, and incorporation, and a sense of empowerment among the non-privileged sectors of the population, and specifically the marginalized sectors of the population. That is, those people who are completely outside of the formal economy, those people who don't have any organizational experience, organizational discipline. I mean, these aren't the workers who belong to unions, who have experience organizationally speaking. These are people who are street vendors and don't have any kind of representation. So the community council programs in Venezuela, which Chavez began and Maduro has promoted, are programs in which communities in the marginalized sectors of the population throughout Venezuela meet in order to choose priority public works projects. They solicit funding for those projects. In a lot of cases, the funding goes directly to them. They administer the public works project. And in other cases, a company, a construction company, is given the contract, but the community council oversees the carrying out of that project. They insist that members of the community, bricklayers, plumbers, electricians who live in that community are the ones who are hired or get preferential hiring treatment. And so they play an active role in the carrying out of programs in their communities. So it seems to me that this is a very important achievement of the Chavista government, both Chavez and Maduro, and that has to be also considered. So just to end, I would say, with regard to solidarity, that these positive aspects, in spite of all the difficulties and in spite of all the mistakes, in my opinion, mistakes, others might have other opinions, might consider other things to be a mistake that I consider to be something else. I mean, we all have opinions and we all have a right to criticize. But it seems to me that if you don't consider the positive aspects of the Maduro government, that solidarity work is going to be very weak, because it doesn't make sense to oppose in an active kind of way the sanctions against Venezuela. It doesn't make sense to oppose the threat of military intervention in Venezuela if you think that the government is no good. So there's a basic discrepancy, a basic incompatibility between that plague on both your houses approach and solidarity. Thank you very much.
You will not be able to stay home, brother.